At my daughter's wedding, they replaced my seat with a trash can. It's just a joke, you grumpy old man. Don't be so dramatic, my son-in-law said. All the guests laughed at me. But when I gave a hand signal, a recording started playing on the big screen. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Alan, and I'm 62 years old. I never imagined that the most humiliating moment of my life would happen at my own daughter's wedding. The day I had been looking forward to for months became the day I realized I had lost Harper completely. And it wasn't to marriage. It was to manipulation. The morning started like any father of the bride day should. I woke up early, ironed my best suit, and practiced my speech one more time in the mirror. Harper had been my world since her mother died 8 years ago. She was 28 now, beautiful, intelligent, with her mother's gentle smile and stubborn streak. When she told me she was marrying Albert, I tried to be happy for her. I really did. Albert Morrison was 31, charming in that slick way that made my skin crawl. He worked in marketing, or so he claimed, always talking about big deals and important clients. Harper met him at a coffee shop downtown 2 years ago, and within 6 months he had moved into the apartment I helped her buy. Within a year, they were engaged. Everything happened so fast, but whenever I tried to suggest they slow down, Harper would get defensive. "Dad, you just don't know him like I do," she would say, her voice taking on that edge it got whenever Albert was criticized. "He makes me happy. Isn't that what matters?" The wedding venue was the Riverside Country Club, the same place where my wife and I had celebrated our anniversary every year. Harper chose it because she said it would make her mother feel close to us. The irony wasn't lost on me. This place that held our happiest memories was about to become the setting for my worst nightmare. I arrived at 3 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the ceremony. The staff was bustling around, arranging flowers and setting up chairs. I went to check the seating arrangement, something I had been quietly dreading. Albert had insisted on handling all the wedding details, claiming he wanted to take the stress off Harper. Every time I offered to help or asked to see the plans, he would smile that practice smile and say everything was under control. The main reception area was elegant, decorated in white and gold with round tables positioned around a small dance floor. Each table had a number and a list of guests. I found table 1, the head table where the wedding party would sit. Table 2 had Harper's college friends. Table 3 had my side of the family, my brother Tom and his wife, my cousin Margaret. I kept looking, expecting to find my name at table 4 or 5, somewhere close to the front. I wasn't at table 6, or 7, or 8. My heart started beating faster as I scanned the remaining tables. Finally, at the back of the room, near the kitchen doors, I saw a small card table that hadn't been there during the rehearsal dinner. It had no number, just a handwritten sign that made my blood run cold. Alan Garrett, special seating. But there was no chair. Instead, sitting behind the table, was a large silver garbage can with a white bow tied around it, and a small placard that read, "Reserved for the father of the bride." I stood there for a full minute, staring at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake, some kind of sick joke by the catering staff. Harper would never allow this. She couldn't possibly know about this. Pretty funny, right? I turned around to find Albert standing behind me, straightening his tie with that smug expression he wore whenever he thought he was being clever. He was dressed in an expensive black tuxedo that probably cost more than my monthly pension. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Albert chuckled, the sound grating against my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Come on, Alan. Don't be so dramatic. It's just a little joke to lighten the mood. You know, break the ice before the ceremony." "A joke?" I felt something hot and sharp rising in my chest. "You want me to sit on a garbage can at my daughter's wedding?" "It's not just any garbage can," Albert said, grinning wider. "We made sure it was a nice one, silver, very classy. Besides, it's symbolic, don't you think? Old things making room for new things." The way he said old things made it clear he wasn't talking about furniture. "Harper knows about this?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Albert's smile faltered for just a second, then returned full force. "Harper thinks it's hilarious. She said you've always had a great sense of humor about these things. Don't you want to make your daughter happy on her special day?" That's when I saw Harper approaching from across the room. She looked stunning in her white dress, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant updo. But when she saw me standing by the garbage can, her expression didn't show surprise or anger. Instead, she looked uncomfortable, like a child caught doing something she knew was wrong but wasn't brave enough to stop. "Dad," she said softly, not quite meeting my eyes, "I see you found your seat." "Harper, sweetheart," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Tell me you didn't know about this." She glanced at Albert, then back at me. It's just for a few minutes during the cocktail hour. Albert thought it would be funny. People will laugh, and then you can move to a regular table for dinner. People will laugh, I repeated slowly. At me, at your father. Dad, don't make this into a big deal, Harper said, her voice taking on that defensive tone again. It's one afternoon. Can't you just go along with it? For me? I looked at my daughter, my only child, the little girl who used to fall asleep in my arms, who called me her hero until she was 15, and I realized I was looking at a stranger. The Harper I knew would never have allowed this. She would have fought anyone who tried to humiliate her father. But this Harper, Albert's Harper, was asking me to accept degradation for the sake of keeping peace. You want me to sit on a garbage can while your wedding guests laugh at me? I said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Just for a little while, she said quietly. Before I could respond, guests started arriving for the cocktail hour. They filtered into the reception area in small groups dressed in their finest clothes, chatting and laughing. It didn't take long for someone to notice the unusual seating arrangement. Oh my God, is that really for Alan? I heard someone whisper. Then the laughter started. Not quiet, polite chuckles, but loud, genuine laughter. People were pulling out their phones to take pictures. A group of Albert's groomsmen were practically doubled over, pointing at the garbage can and making jokes I couldn't quite hear but could definitely imagine. Come on, Alan, Albert said loudly. Loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Don't be such a drama queen, it's just a joke. Show everyone you're a good sport. The room was watching now. Dozens of eyes focused on me, waiting to see what I would do. Some faces showed amusement, others curiosity, and a few, mostly my relatives, showed embarrassment and anger on my behalf. But no one spoke up. No one told Albert this was wrong. They just watched and waited for the show. I felt my chest tighten, the familiar ache that had been my companion since my wife died intensifying until I could barely breathe. This wasn't just humiliation. This was erasure. Albert wasn't just making me look foolish. He was making me disappear, reducing me to a joke, a relic to be laughed at and forgotten. Harper stood beside her husband-to-be, her face flushed but her silence deafening. My daughter, who I had raised to stand up for what was right, was watching her father be humiliated and doing nothing to stop it. That's when I realized Albert hadn't just been working to marry Harper. He had been working to isolate her, to turn her against me, to make her choose between us. And tonight, in front of all these people, she had made her choice. But Albert had made one crucial mistake. He thought he knew everything about me, thought I was just a harmless old man who would quietly accept whatever scraps of dignity he chose to leave me. He had no idea what I had discovered about him 3 months ago, or what I was prepared to do with that information. As I stood there looking at the garbage can that was supposed to be my throne of humiliation, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and deep, but underneath it was something else. Something harder and more dangerous. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the small remote control I had hidden there. Tonight, Albert Morrison was going to learn that underestimating people was a very expensive mistake. The path to this moment had started 18 months ago, though I didn't realize it at the time. I remember the exact conversation that should have been my first warning. Harper had called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice strained in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Dad, we need to talk," she said without her usual warm greeting. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" There was a long pause, the kind that meant she was choosing her words carefully. "It's about Albert. He's been telling me some things about how you've been acting around him, and I need to know if they're true." My stomach dropped. "What kind of things?" "He says you've been cold to him, dismissive, that you make comments about his job and his background when I'm not around. He thinks you don't approve of our relationship." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the same one where I'd eaten breakfast with Harper every morning during her high school years. "Harper, I've barely spent 10 minutes alone with Albert. When have I had time to make these comments?" "See, this is what I'm talking about," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You're being defensive instead of just listening to what I'm saying." That conversation lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, I felt like I was talking to a different person. The Harper I knew would have laughed at the suggestion that I was anything but welcoming to her boyfriends. She had always been able to read people well, had always trusted her own judgment. But this Harper seemed to doubt everything she knew about me. Over the following months, these conversations became more frequent. Albert would report incidents that had never happened, times when I supposedly criticized him, moments when I allegedly made him feel unwelcome in my home. Harper would call me, upset and confused, asking me to explain behavior that existed only in Albert's imagination. "He says you told him he wasn't good enough for me," she said during one particularly painful call. "Harper, when did I supposedly say this?" "Last Sunday when you were grilling burgers. He says you pulled him aside and told him he should find someone more his level. I remembered that Sunday clearly. Albert had spent the entire afternoon on his phone, barely speaking to anyone. I had asked him once if he wanted to help with the cooking, and he had declined without looking up from his screen. We had maybe exchanged 20 words the entire day. Sweetheart, that never happened. We barely spoke last Sunday. But why would he lie about something like that? Harper asked, and I could hear the genuine confusion in her voice. What would he gain from making it up? That was the question that kept me awake at night. What did Albert gain from turning Harper against me? At first, I thought it was simple insecurity. Maybe he felt threatened by our close relationship and wanted to create distance. But as the months passed and his stories became more elaborate and more frequent, I began to suspect something darker. The real breakthrough came 6 months ago when my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, mentioned seeing Harper at the grocery store. She looked so thin, Alan, and tired. Is she okay? When I asked Harper about it, she brushed off my concerns. I've just been stressed with work and wedding planning. Albert says I worry too much about things that don't matter. That phrase, Albert says, had become the beginning of most of Harper's sentences. Albert says I should focus on my career instead of family drama. Albert says older people sometimes get set in their ways and resist change. Albert says it's normal for families to grow apart when children get married. I started paying closer attention to Harper during our visits. She had always been animated, full of opinions and stories about her work, her friends, her plans for the future. But gradually, she became quieter, more hesitant to express her own thoughts. She would start to tell me something, then stop and say, "Actually, Albert thinks I shouldn't burden you with my problems." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place 3 months ago. I was having coffee with my old friend, Detective Ray Morrison, no relation to Albert despite the shared last name. Ray had recently retired after 30 years with the police department, and we met monthly to catch up and complain about our arthritis. "You know, Alan," Ray said as we sat in our usual booth at Martha's Diner, "I've been thinking about what you told me about Harper's boyfriend. The way you describe his behavior, the constant undermining, the isolation tactics, the rewriting of events, it sounds like a textbook case of psychological manipulation." "Psychological manipulation?" I repeated. "You mean like brainwashing?" "Not brainwashing exactly, but close. We saw it a lot in domestic cases. The abuser doesn't usually start with physical violence. They start by making their victim doubt their own perceptions, their own memories. They isolate them from family and friends by creating conflict and mistrust. By the time the victim realizes what's happening, they're so emotionally dependent on the abuser that they can't break free." Ray explained how these manipulators operated. They were often charming and convincing to outsiders, which made their victims' claims seem unrealistic. They would tell small lies that were hard to prove, then gradually escalate to bigger deceptions. They created a reality where their version of events was the only truth that mattered. "The scary thing," Ray said, "is that these guys are usually very good at choosing their targets. They look for people who are naturally trusting, who value harmony over conflict, people who would rather believe the best about someone than face an ugly truth." That description fit Harper perfectly. She had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over arguments and found compromise solutions. After her mother died, she had thrown herself into taking care of everyone else's emotional needs, often at the expense of her own. "So what can I do?" I asked Ray. "If Harper doesn't believe me about Albert, how can I protect her?" Ray stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "In my experience, these situations usually have to play out. The victim has to see the truth for themselves. But sometimes, if you can document the manipulation, if you can prove that the abuser is lying, it can break the spell." That conversation planted a seed that grew into a plan. I started documenting every interaction with Albert, every conversation with Harper, every lie and contradiction. I hired a private investigator, something I never thought I would do in my lifetime, to dig deeper into Albert's background. What we found was worse than I had imagined. Albert Morrison wasn't just a manipulator, he was a serial manipulator. My investigator, a woman named Sarah Chen, daughter of my neighbor, had traced Albert's history through 3 previous relationships. In each case, the pattern was identical. He would charm his way into a woman's life, gradually isolate her from her support system, then disappear once he had gotten what he wanted. His first victim was named Jennifer Walsh, Sarah explained as she spread photos and documents across my kitchen table. He dated her for 2 years, convinced her to take out loans to fund his business ventures, then vanished when she was $20,000 in debt. The second victim was Maria Santos, a teacher who had helped Albert through what he claimed was a difficult period after his father's death. She had let him move into her apartment, had supported him financially while he supposedly looked for work, had even introduced him to her family as her future husband. After 8 months, he disappeared with her jewelry and the money from her savings account. The third victim was Lisa Park, who had met Albert just 6 months before he started dating Harper. Sarah had managed to locate Lisa through social media and convinced her to meet with us. The story Lisa told made my blood run cold. He told me his name was Albert Martin, Lisa said as we sat in a quiet restaurant outside the city. He said he was an entrepreneur, that he was working on a revolutionary marketing concept that would make us both rich. I believed him because he was so confident, so sure of himself. He made me feel like the most important person in the world. Lisa explained how Albert had systematically isolated her from her friends and family, using the same techniques he was now using on Harper. He had convinced her that her parents were controlling, that her friends were jealous of their relationship, that only he truly understood and appreciated her. The worst part, Lisa said, tears in her eyes, was that he made me doubt my own sanity. He would tell me I had said things I never said, that I had agreed to things I never agreed to. When I tried to argue, he would act hurt and confused, like I was being unreasonable. Eventually, it was easier to just agree with him than to fight. Albert had disappeared from Lisa's life just 2 weeks before he met Harper. She had filed a police report, but without concrete evidence of theft or fraud, there was little the authorities could do. He had been too careful, too clever in his manipulations. I tried to warn your daughter, Lisa told me. I found her on social media and sent her a message explaining who Albert really was, but he must have seen it first because she never responded. A few days later, I got a message from her account telling me to stop harassing her boyfriend with my lies. As I sat in my car after meeting with Lisa, I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever experienced. Albert hadn't just stolen money from these women, he had stolen their sense of reality, their ability to trust their own judgment, and now he was doing the same thing to Harper. But tonight, finally, I had everything I needed to expose him. The investigator had done more than just uncover Albert's past victims. She had found something that would destroy him completely, something so damning that even Harper wouldn't be able to deny the truth. As I stood in that wedding reception, watching guests laugh at the garbage can that was supposed to be my seat, I thought about the recording device in my pocket and the bombshell I was about to drop. Albert Morrison thought he had won, thought he had successfully turned my daughter against me while securing his next victim. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The laughter in the reception hall was reaching its peak when I made my decision. Albert was basking in the attention, telling anyone who would listen how good-natured I was being about the joke. Harper stood beside him, her smile forced but her silence complete. She had chosen her side and it wasn't mine. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small remote control I had hidden there. Earlier that morning, I had worked with the venue's audiovisual technician to set up a surprise presentation. I told him it was a special tribute video for Harper, something to play during the reception. He had been happy to help, setting up the large screen and sound system that Albert had requested for their wedding slideshow. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying across the room. The chatter died down as heads turned toward me. "Before we begin the evening's festivities, I have a special presentation for the happy couple." Albert's face lit up with what he probably thought was anticipation, but looked more like greed to me. He loved being the center of attention, loved any opportunity to be celebrated or admired. Harper looked confused but pleased, probably thinking I was finally embracing the spirit of her wedding. "That's so sweet, Dad," she said, her voice carrying that artificial brightness she had developed since dating Albert. "We weren't expecting anything like this." "Oh, I think you'll find it very educational," I replied, pressing the first button on the remote. The large screen at the front of the reception hall flickered to life. Instead of wedding photos or a sentimental tribute, the guests found themselves looking at a split-screen image. On the left side was Albert Morrison, the man they all knew as Harper's devoted fiancé. On the right side was the same man, but in different clothes, with his arm around a different woman. The woman was named Rebecca Morrison. She was Albert's wife. A collective gasp swept through the room. Harper's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Albert's face went pale, then red, then pale again as he stared at the screen in horror. "What is this?" Harper whispered, but her voice was lost in the growing murmur of confused and shocked guests. I pressed the second button on the remote, and the audio began to play. It was a phone conversation between Albert and Rebecca, recorded just 3 weeks ago by the private investigator I had hired. "Baby, I know this is hard." Albert's voice filled the reception hall through the professional sound system. "But the plan is working perfectly. Harper has no idea about us, and after we're married, I'll have access to all her assets. Her father left her a trust fund worth over $200,000, plus the apartment and her savings." Rebecca's voice came through clearly. "How much longer do we have to keep this up? The kids are asking when Daddy is coming home." "Just a few more months," Albert replied. "Once I'm legally married to her, I can start transferring money out of her accounts. We'll let it play out for maybe 6 months, then I'll file for divorce and claim half of everything. With what we get from Harper, plus what I already took from the last one, we'll have enough to disappear somewhere nice. Maybe Costa Rica. The reception hall had gone completely silent except for the damning recording. Harper was shaking her head, her face white as her wedding dress. Some guests were holding up their phones, recording the disaster unfolding before them. "Turn it off," Albert said, his voice barely audible. "Turn it off right now." But I wasn't finished. I pressed the third button and new images appeared on the screen. Wedding photos, but not from today. These were from Albert and Rebecca's wedding 4 years ago in Nevada. Then came more photos. Albert with Rebecca and their 2 children, a boy and a girl who looked to be about 6 and 8 years old. Family photos from birthday parties, Christmas mornings, vacation trips to Disneyland. "This is fake," Albert said desperately, his voice rising. "This is all fake. He's doctored these photos. This is some kind of elaborate revenge because he doesn't approve of our relationship." But his protests were drowned out by the continuing audio recording. Now it was a different conversation, this one between Albert and a man whose voice I didn't recognize. The identity theft was genius, the unknown man was saying, creating a whole new background for yourself, complete with fake employment records and credit history. "How long did it take you to set up the Albert Morrison identity?" "About 6 months, Albert replied proudly. "The real Albert Morrison died in a car accident in Oregon 3 years ago. Single guy, no family, same age as me. I just started using his social security number and built a whole new life around it." Harper made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a scream. She was staring at the man she had just married, seeing him clearly for the first time. "Your name isn't even Albert?" "Harper, let me explain," the man she knew as Albert said, reaching for her arm. "This is all taken out of context. Your father has manipulated these recordings." But Harper stepped away from him, her whole body trembling. "What's your real name?" she demanded. When he didn't answer, I spoke for him. "His real name is Marcus Webb. He's wanted in 3 states for identity theft, fraud, and bigamy. The private investigator I hired tracked him through 4 different identities and at least 6 different victims over the past 10 years. The room erupted in chaos. Some guests were shouting questions. Others were heading for the exits. Albert's groomsmen looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Harper's bridesmaids surrounded her, their shocked faces pale in the elegant lighting. "You're lying," Albert, Marcus, whatever his name was, said. But his voice lacked conviction. "Harper, you know me. You know I love you. Your father is just a bitter old man who can't stand to see you happy." Harper looked at him with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was the look of someone seeing a monster for the first time. "The phone calls you took in private, the business trips that never made sense, the way you always wanted to handle our finances. Harper, please, the way you turned me against my father," she continued, her voice getting stronger. "The stories you told me about things he supposedly said, things he supposedly did. None of it was true, was it?" I pressed the final button on the remote and the screen showed one last image. It was a police report filed by Rebecca Morrison 3 days ago, reporting her husband missing. The report included a photo and a detailed description that matched the man standing in front of us exactly. "His wife filed a missing person report," I explained to the stunned crowd. "She's been looking for him for weeks, worried that something terrible had happened. She has no idea he's been living a double life, preparing to commit bigamy so he could steal from another woman." The man who had called himself Albert Morrison looked around the room desperately, searching for an escape route or an ally. But there was nowhere to run and no one left to convince. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, devastating. Harper was crying now. Great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. She pulled off her wedding ring and threw it at his feet. "Get out," she said, her voice breaking. "Get out of here before I call the police myself." "Harper, we can work this out," he pleaded. "I can explain everything. The recording is doctored. The photos are fake. Your father is trying to destroy us because he's jealous of what we have." But Harper wasn't listening anymore. She was looking at me with an expression of dawning horror and shame. "Dad," she whispered. "Oh God, Dad, what have I done?" I wanted to go to her, to hold her and tell her it wasn't her fault, that she was the victim here. But first, I had to make sure Marcus Webb couldn't hurt anyone else. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "I'd like to report a wanted fugitive," I said calmly, my eyes never leaving the man who had tried to destroy my daughter's life. "He's at the Riverside Country Club, and he's not going anywhere." Marcus made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. He grabbed Harper's arm and tried to pull her toward the exit. "We're leaving. Now, don't listen to any more of his lies." But Harper jerked away from him with such force that she stumbled backward into one of the decorated tables. "Don't touch me," she screamed. "Don't ever touch me again." The sound of sirens was already growing louder in the distance. Marcus finally realized that his game was over, that all his careful planning and manipulation had come to nothing. He looked around the room one last time, his charming mask finally slipping to reveal the cold, calculating predator underneath. "You have no idea what you've done, old man," he said to me, his voice filled with venom. "She'll never forgive you for this. Even if everything you've shown them is true, she'll hate you for destroying her wedding day." I looked at Harper, who was surrounded by her bridesmaids but staring directly at me. Her face was streaked with tears and makeup, her perfect wedding dress wrinkled and stained, but for the first time in months, I saw my real daughter looking back at me. "No," I said quietly. "She'll thank me for saving her life." As the police cars pulled into the country club's parking lot, their red and blue lights flashing through the reception hall windows, I realized that the garbage can I was supposed to sit on was the least important thing that had happened here today. Marcus Webb had tried to make me disappear from Harper's life, but instead he had disappeared from ours forever. The police officers who responded to my call were professionals, but even they seemed stunned by the scope of what they found at the Riverside Country Club. Detective Sarah Martinez, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, took charge of the scene while her partner worked to calm the crowd of wedding guests who had just witnessed the collapse of what they thought was a fairy tale romance. Marcus Webb, I refused to think of him as Albert anymore, had tried to run when he heard the sirens, but several of the male wedding guests, including my brother Tom and Harper's college friend David, had blocked the exits. He was cornered in the country club's kitchen when the officers found him, crouched behind a steel prep table like the coward he was. "Sir, I need you to come with us," Detective Martinez said firmly as she approached him with handcuffs ready. "This is all a misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice taking on that smooth, persuasive tone he had perfected over years of manipulation. "I'm the victim here. That man," he pointed at me, "has been harassing me and my fiancée for months. He doctored those recordings and photos because he disapproves of our relationship." Detective Martinez looked at me, then back at Marcus. "Sir, we'll sort all this out at the station. Right now I need you to place your hands behind your back." "I demand to speak to my lawyer," Marcus said, but he was already being cuffed and read his rights. As they led him away, he turned back to look at Harper one last time. "This isn't over, Harper. When you realize what your father has done to us, when you understand how he's manipulated you, you'll come back to me. I'll be waiting." Harper flinched as if he had slapped her, and I saw something break inside her at those words. Even now, even caught red-handed, Marcus was trying to plant seeds of doubt, trying to make her question her own perception of reality. The reception hall was in chaos. Most of the guests had left, either too shocked to stay or too uncomfortable to witness the private family drama that was unfolding. The caterers were quietly packing up the untouched dinner, and the wedding photographer had stopped taking pictures after the first police car arrived. Harper stood in the middle of it all, still in her wedding dress, looking lost and broken. Her bridesmaids hovered nearby, unsure whether to comfort her or give her space. The beautiful reception that had cost thousands of dollars was over before it had truly begun. "Harper," I said softly, approaching her carefully. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" She looked at me with red, swollen eyes. "Am I okay?" she repeated, her voice hollow. "Dad, I just found out that the man I married this afternoon is a complete stranger, that everything about our relationship was a lie, that I've spent the last 18 months treating you like the enemy while defending a criminal. How could I possibly be okay?" I wanted to reach out and hug her, but I could see she was barely holding herself together. "We need to get you out of this dress and somewhere quiet where you can process what just happened." "The honeymoon suite," Harper said with a bitter laugh. "We booked the honeymoon suite upstairs. How's that for irony?" Detective Martinez approached us, her expression sympathetic but businesslike. "Miss Garrett, I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about your relationship with the suspect. There may be financial crimes involved, and we need to understand the full scope of his activities." Harper nodded numbly. "Of course, whatever you need. Did he have access to your bank accounts? Credit cards? Any financial documents?" The question seemed to wake Harper up, cutting through her shock with a jolt of fear. Yes, he did. We combined our finances 6 months ago when we moved in together. He said it would be easier for wedding planning and budgeting for our future." Detective Martinez and I exchanged a look. "We'll need you to contact your bank first thing tomorrow morning," she said. "Check all your accounts, credit reports, anything he might have had access to. Document any unauthorized transactions or new accounts opened in your name." As the detective continued asking questions, I watched my daughter's face as the full implications of Marcus's deception became clear. She wasn't just dealing with the emotional betrayal of discovering her husband was a fake. She was potentially facing financial ruin as well. The business trips, Harper said suddenly, her voice sharp with realization. He went on business trips almost every weekend for the past 3 months. He said he was meeting with potential clients, building his consulting business, but he was going home to his real family, wasn't he? I nodded grimly. According to the investigator, he's been living a double life for months, telling his wife Rebecca that he was working out of state, telling you he was building a business that didn't exist. Harper's legs seemed to give out, and she sank into one of the reception chairs. The wedding expenses. He insisted on paying for everything himself, said he wanted to spoil me, but he was using my money, wasn't he? The money he transferred from our joint account. We'll find out tomorrow when you talk to the bank, Detective Martinez said gently, but right now you need to focus on taking care of yourself. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? Family or friends who can be with you? Before Harper could answer, my brother Tom appeared at my elbow. He had been quiet during the confrontation, but I could see the anger simmering in his eyes. She's staying with us tonight, he said firmly. Margaret's already gone home to set up the guest room and make some calls to cancel the honeymoon reservations. Harper looked up at him with surprise. Uncle Tom, you don't have to. Yes, we do, he interrupted. Alan, you did the right thing tonight. I know it wasn't easy, and I know Harper might not see it that way right now, but you saved her from years of hell. As if his words had opened a floodgate, Harper began to cry again. Not the shocked, silent tears from earlier, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. I can't believe I fell for it, she gasped between sobs. I can't believe I was so stupid. You weren't stupid, I said, finally moving close enough to put my arm around her shoulders. You were kind and trusting and loving. Those are good qualities, Harper. The fact that someone took advantage of them doesn't make you foolish. But I turned against you, she said, looking up at me with anguish. All those times he told me you said things you never said, did things you never did. I believed him instead of believing you. I let him convince me that you were the problem. The pain in her voice was almost unbearable. Sweetheart, that's what manipulators do. They're experts at making their victims doubt their own perceptions. You're not the first person to fall for this kind of psychological abuse, and you won't be the last. Detective Martinez finished taking Harper's initial statement and handed her a business card. Call me tomorrow after you've spoken with your bank. We'll need detailed records of any financial transactions. And depending on what we find, we may need to involve federal authorities if he's been moving money across state lines. As the detective left, the three of us, Harper, Tom, and I, stood in the empty reception hall surrounded by the remnants of what should have been the happiest day of Harper's life. The flowers were wilting, the candles had burned down to nothing, and the garbage can with its white bow sat forgotten near the back wall, like a prop from a very bad joke. Dad, Harper said quietly, when did you know? When did you first suspect that Albert wasn't who he claimed to be? I thought about it for a moment. I think part of me knew something was wrong from the beginning. He was too smooth, too charming, too eager to isolate you from everyone who cared about you. But I didn't have proof until 3 months ago when I hired the private investigator. 3 months? Harper's eyes widened. You knew for 3 months and didn't tell me? I tried to tell you, sweetheart, but every time I brought up concerns about Albert, you shut me down. He had convinced you that I was the problem, that I was trying to sabotage your happiness. If I had shown you the evidence before tonight, you wouldn't have believed it. You would have thought I had fabricated it out of jealousy or spite. Harper was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Finally, she said, the garbage can, making me watch while everyone laughed at you. That was his final test, wasn't it? To see if I would choose him over you completely. I think so, yes. And I failed the test. Her voice was barely a whisper. I stood there and watched my father be humiliated, and I did nothing to stop it. Tom spoke up before I could respond. Harper, you were being psychologically manipulated by an expert. Don't blame yourself for falling victim to someone whose entire livelihood depends on being convincing. As we finally prepared to leave the country club, Harper paused at the entrance to look back at the reception hall one last time. I keep thinking about his real wife, she said. Rebecca. She's been worried sick about him, filing missing person reports, probably blaming herself for whatever she thinks drove him away. And all this time he's been here, planning to steal my money and abandon both of us. The police will contact her tonight, I assured her. She'll finally have answers, even if they're not the answers she was hoping for. Harper nodded, then turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. Complete trust and vulnerability. Dad, I'm so sorry. For everything. For not believing you. For choosing him over you. For letting him drive a wedge between us. I don't know how you can ever forgive me. I pulled her into a hug, holding her tight against my chest the way I used to when she was small and the world seemed too big and scary. There's nothing to forgive, sweetheart. You're my daughter, and I love you. That never changed, not even when you couldn't see it. As we walked out into the cool evening air, I realized that Marcus Webb had made one critical miscalculation. He had assumed that breaking Harper's trust in me would give him complete control over her. But what he didn't understand was that real love, the kind between a father and daughter, doesn't disappear just because someone tries to poison it. It just waits patiently for the truth to set it free. The week following the wedding was a blur of police interviews, bank meetings, and legal consultations. Harper moved back into her old room at my house temporarily, while we sorted through the financial damage Marcus had caused. Having her home again after all those months of tension and distance should have been a relief, but the silence between us was heavier than any argument we had ever had. She spent most of those first few days in her room, emerging only for meals that we ate in uncomfortable quiet. I could hear her on the phone with the bank, with credit card companies, with lawyers, her voice flat and businesslike as she tried to untangle the web of financial manipulation Marcus had woven around her life. On Thursday morning, she came downstairs with a stack of papers and sat across from me at the kitchen table where we used to eat breakfast together when she was in high school. Her eyes were red from crying, but her jaw was set with a determination I recognized from her mother. "I need to tell you how bad it is," she said without preamble. I set down my coffee cup and gave her my full attention. "Okay, he stole $43,000 from my savings account over the past 6 months. Small transfers, nothing big enough to trigger alerts from the bank. He opened 3 credit cards in my name and maxed them out. That's another $28,000 in debt. He took out a personal loan using my apartment as collateral for $15,000. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking as she read from the papers. "Jesus, Harper. There's more. He convinced me to add him to my checking account so he could help manage our wedding expenses. He used that access to write checks to himself, totaling another $12,000. In total, he stole nearly $100,000 from me." I felt sick. What did the bank say? Can any of it be recovered? Harper let out a bitter laugh. "Some of it, maybe. Since I voluntarily gave him access to some of the accounts, it's not technically theft in all cases. The credit cards opened without my knowledge are clear fraud, so those debts should be forgiven. But the money he transferred from accounts I had given him permission to access, that's going to be much harder to prove wasn't legitimate." We sat in silence for a few minutes while I processed the scope of Marcus's theft. It wasn't just the money, though that was devastating enough. It was the systematic way he had planned and executed Harper's financial destruction while she trusted him completely. "I keep thinking about all the times he complained that I was being too careful with money," Harper said quietly. "He would say things like, 'You can't take it with you,' and 'We need to start living like the successful couple we're going to be.' I thought he was encouraging me to be less anxious about finances. I didn't realize he was conditioning me to ignore my instincts about protecting my assets. Harper, you couldn't have known. He's clearly done this before, and he's had years to perfect his techniques." She looked up at me with an expression that was part gratitude, part anguish. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. When I was defending him to you, when I was choosing his version of events over yours, did you hate me?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "Harper, no, never. Not for 1 second. But I was so awful to you. I accused you of being jealous and controlling. I told you that you were trying to sabotage my happiness because you couldn't stand to see me with someone who made me feel loved." Her voice broke on the last words. I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. "Sweetheart, you were being psychologically manipulated by an expert. Every reaction you had, every choice you made, was the result of months of carefully planned emotional abuse. You're not responsible for falling victim to that, but I should have known better. I should have trusted you instead of him." "Why?" "He spent months convincing you that I was the problem. He told you stories about things I supposedly said and did, things that sounded just plausible enough to plant seeds of doubt. He isolated you from me gradually, so subtly that you didn't even realize it was happening. That's not your fault, Harper. That's what predators do." She pulled her hands free and wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "I keep thinking about Mom, about what she would say if she could see what I've become. She taught me to be strong and independent, to trust my instincts and stand up for myself. Instead, I let a man convince me that my own father was my enemy." The mention of my wife sent a familiar ache through my chest. Susan had been gone for 8 years, but I still missed her wisdom and her gentle strength every day. She would have seen through Marcus immediately, would have protected Harper from his manipulation. "Your mother would be proud of you," I said firmly. "She would be proud that you found the courage to face the truth when it was presented to you. She would be proud that you're fighting to rebuild your life instead of wallowing in self-pity. And she would be furious at Marcus for trying to destroy her daughter." For the first time since the wedding disaster, Harper smiled. It was a small, sad smile, but it was genuine. She would have hated him, wouldn't she? She would have seen right through his act from day one. "Your mother had an incredible ability to read people. She always said that someone's true character shows up in how they treat people who can't do anything for them. Like how Albert treated waiters and store clerks, Harper said, the realization dawning on her face. He was always impatient with them, dismissive. I told myself it was just because he was focused and driven, but Mom would have known better. We talked for 3 hours that morning, really talked for the first time since Marcus had entered Harper's life. She told me about the little things that had bothered her but that she had pushed aside, the way he criticized her friends, the way he discouraged her from spending time with family, the way he made her feel guilty for wanting to maintain her independence. He had an answer for everything, she said. When I questioned something he did or said, he always had a reasonable explanation. When I felt uncomfortable about a decision he was pushing me toward, he made me feel like I was being irrational or overly emotional. That's called gaslighting, I explained. It's a form of psychological manipulation where the abuser makes their victim question their own sanity and perceptions. It's one of the most effective tools predators use because it's so subtle and gradual. Harper was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Finally, she said, I want to help catch him. I want to make sure he can't do this to anyone else. The police said they have enough evidence to charge him with identity theft and fraud. The federal authorities are getting involved because he crossed state lines and used false identities. He's looking at serious prison time. That's not enough, Harper said, her voice hardening. I want to find his other victims. I want to help them get justice too, and I want to make sure his real wife knows exactly what kind of man she's married to. I studied my daughter's face, seeing a strength there that reminded me so much of her mother it took my breath away. Are you sure you're ready for that? It's going to mean reliving everything that happened, probably testifying in court, facing him again. I'm sure, Harper said without hesitation. He tried to destroy my life, Dad. He tried to turn me against you and steal everything I had worked for. He made me doubt my own sanity and my own worth. I'm not going to let him get away with that, and I'm not going to let him do it to anyone else. That afternoon, Detective Martinez came to the house to update us on the investigation. She sat in our living room with a thick file folder, her expression serious but optimistic. We've made contact with Rebecca Morrison, his legal wife, she began. She's devastated, of course, but she's cooperating fully with the investigation. She had no idea about his other identities or his criminal activities. She thought he was working as a traveling consultant. What about his children? Harper asked. Are they okay? They're confused and hurt, but they're safe. Rebecca has family support and she's already filed for divorce. She's also provided us with financial records that show a pattern of unexplained income over the past few years, money that we now know came from his various fraud schemes. Detective Martinez opened her file and pulled out several photographs. We've also identified at least 3 more victims in addition to the ones your private investigator found. Marcus Webb has been running these romance scams for at least 7 years, possibly longer. The total amount stolen from all his victims is approaching $500,000. Harper's face went pale. $500,000. How many women has he destroyed? At least 8 that we know of so far. The FBI is taking over the case because of the multi-state nature of his crimes and the scope of the financial fraud. They're going to want to interview you extensively, Harper. Your testimony will be crucial in establishing his pattern of behavior. I'll do whatever it takes, Harper said immediately. After Detective Martinez left, Harper and I sat on the front porch watching the sunset. It was something we used to do regularly when she was younger, but we hadn't shared this kind of peaceful moment in almost 2 years. Dad, she said quietly, I need to ask you something else. Anything. When you hired the private investigator and started gathering evidence against Albert, Marcus, whatever his name is, were you hoping I would figure it out on my own? Were you waiting for me to come to you? I considered the question carefully. Part of me was hoping that, yes. I thought maybe if I just stayed consistent, if I kept being your father and loving you despite everything he was telling you about me, you might start to see the contradictions in his stories. But you were also prepared to expose him whether I figured it out or not. Yes, I couldn't let you marry him knowing what I knew, even if it meant you might never forgive me. Harper reached over and took my hand. I'm so sorry it came to that. I'm sorry you had to choose between protecting me and losing me. I never lost you, I said, squeezing her hand. You were still there, still my daughter, even when you couldn't see it. Marcus tried to erase me from your life, but he underestimated something. What's that? He underestimated how much your father loves you, and how much you love him deep down, even when someone is trying to convince you otherwise. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I realized that Marcus Webb had actually done us an unintentional favor. His betrayal had been so complete, so devastating, that it had shattered all the walls he had built between Harper and me. Now we could rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth and mutual respect, stronger than it had ever been before. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more legal proceedings, more painful reminders of how close Harper had come to losing everything. But tonight my daughter was home. She was safe, and she knew without a doubt that her father would always fight for her. That was worth more than all the money Marcus had stolen. 8 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse watching Marcus Webb, whose real name turned out to be Marcus David Thompson, being sentenced for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and bigamy. Harper sat beside me, her posture straight and confident, no trace of the broken woman who had collapsed in her wedding dress that terrible night. The past 8 months had been a journey of healing and justice that I never could have imagined. The FBI investigation had uncovered a criminal network that stretched back over a decade. Marcus wasn't just a simple con man, he was part of an organized group that specialized in romance fraud, sharing techniques and even identities to maximize their profits. Harper had become the star witness in the federal case. Her testimony about Marcus's psychological manipulation tactics had helped prosecutors establish a pattern of behavior that connected him to crimes in 7 different states. She had spoken to a packed courtroom about the way he had systematically isolated her from her family, stolen her money, and nearly destroyed her sense of reality. The defendant didn't just steal money from these women, Harper had said during her testimony, her voice clear and strong. He stole their ability to trust themselves, their confidence in their own judgment, their faith in love itself. The financial damage can be repaired over time, but the psychological damage lasts much longer. As the judge read Marcus's sentence, 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 8 years, I watched his face for any sign of remorse or recognition of the pain he had caused. There was none. Even now, he maintained the cold, calculating expression of someone who saw his victims as nothing more than sources of income. After the sentencing, Harper and I walked out of the courthouse together into the bright spring sunshine. She had rebuilt her life in ways that amazed me every day. The financial damage from Marcus's theft had been largely repaired through insurance claims and restitution orders, but more importantly, she had rebuilt her confidence and her ability to trust her own instincts. "How do you feel?" I asked as we stood on the courthouse steps. Harper was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Relieved," she said finally. "Not just because he's going to prison, but because this whole chapter of my life is finally closed. I can move forward now without looking over my shoulder." She had already started moving forward in remarkable ways. 3 months after the wedding disaster, Harper had gone back to school to become a counselor specializing in helping victims of psychological abuse. She wanted to use her experience to help other women recognize the warning signs of manipulation before they lost everything. "I know what it feels like to have someone systematically destroy your sense of reality," she had told me when she first mentioned her career change. "I want to help other women trust themselves again." As we walked to my car, Harper's phone rang. She answered with a smile that had become familiar over the past few months. "Hi, James," she said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in her voice. James Patterson was a fellow student in Harper's counseling program, a widower in his 30s who had returned to school after losing his wife to cancer. He was kind, patient, and most importantly, he encouraged Harper to maintain her independence and her close relationships with family and friends. The contrast with Marcus couldn't have been more stark. "Dad and I just left the courthouse," Harper was saying. "Yes, 15 years. We'll celebrate tonight at dinner. We'll celebrate." After she hung up, she turned to me with a slightly embarrassed expression. "James asked if he could join us for dinner tonight. I hope that's okay." "Of course it's okay," I said, and I meant it. James had been nothing but respectful to me, never trying to come between Harper and me the way Marcus had. In fact, he often encouraged Harper to spend time with me, understanding that a healthy relationship should strengthen family bonds, not weaken them. As we drove home, Harper was unusually quiet. Finally, she said, "Dad, can I ask you something that's been bothering me? Always. Do you think I would have figured it out eventually? If you hadn't exposed Marcus at the wedding, do you think I would have realized what he was doing to me?" It was a question she had asked several times over the past months, and I understood why it haunted her. She needed to believe that she wasn't completely helpless, that some part of her would have recognized the truth eventually. "I think you were already starting to figure it out," I said honestly. "The private investigator noticed that you seemed uncomfortable at the rehearsal dinner, like part of you knew something was wrong. And you told me yourself that you had been having doubts about some of Marcus's stories, but I might not have acted on those doubts. Maybe not, but Harper, that's not the important question. The important question is what you did when you were faced with undeniable proof of who he really was. You could have chosen to believe his lies even then. You could have convinced yourself that I had somehow fabricated the evidence. Instead, you chose to face the truth even though it was devastating." Harper nodded, but I could see she was still struggling with self-doubt. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm too naive to ever have a healthy relationship, if I'm too trusting, too willing to believe the best about people. Those qualities aren't weaknesses, sweetheart. They're what make you a good person." The problem wasn't that you were too trusting. The problem was that Marcus was a skilled predator who targeted those exact qualities. But look how you've used this experience. You're helping other women avoid the same trap. You're building a relationship with James based on honesty and mutual respect. You've turned your worst experience into something that's making you stronger and helping others. We pulled into the driveway of the house where Harper had grown up, the house where she was living again while she finished school. She had initially been embarrassed about moving back home at 28, but I treasured every day of having her close again. That evening, James joined us for dinner at the same restaurant where my wife and I had celebrated our wedding anniversary every year. Harper had suggested it, saying she wanted to replace the painful associations with new happy memories. As I watched Harper and James together over dinner, I was struck by the difference in her demeanor compared to how she had been with Marcus. With Marcus, she had been constantly on edge, always trying to say the right thing, always worried about disappointing him. With James, she was relaxed and genuinely herself. "Alan," James said as we were finishing our dessert, "I want to thank you for what you did for Harper. I know it couldn't have been easy to risk your relationship with her to protect her. Any father would have done the same thing," I replied. "No," James said seriously. "Not every father would have had the courage to act when it meant potentially losing his daughter forever. And not every father would have forgiven her for choosing a manipulator over him, even temporarily." Harper reached over and squeezed my hand. "James is right, Dad. I put you through hell, and you never stopped loving me or fighting for me." Looking at my daughter across the table, healthy, happy, pursuing a career that would help other women, I realized that Marcus Webb had ultimately failed in every way that mattered. He had tried to isolate Harper from me, but our relationship was now stronger than ever. He had tried to steal her money, but she had recovered financially and was building a career that would provide both income and meaning. He had tried to destroy her ability to trust, but she had learned to trust herself again and was building a new relationship based on mutual respect and honesty. Most importantly, he had tried to make her into a victim, but she had chosen to become a survivor. 6 months later, I stood in another reception hall, but this time the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Harper was receiving an award from the State Counseling Association for her work with abuse victims. She had completed her degree in record time and had already helped dozens of women recognize and escape manipulative relationships. As she gave her acceptance speech, I felt a pride that went deeper than any I had ever experienced. Not just pride in her professional accomplishments, but pride in the strength and wisdom she had shown in rebuilding her life. "My father once told me that the most important thing about falling down is learning how to get back up," Harper said from the podium. "I fell down hard and I fell down publicly, but with the help of people who truly loved me, I learned that getting back up isn't just about recovery. It's about using your experience to help others avoid the same fall." After the ceremony, as we walked to our cars, Harper turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Dad, I need to tell you something." "What's that, sweetheart?" "I'm grateful it happened." I stopped walking, shocked by her words. "What?" "I'm grateful that Marcus came into my life and showed me what manipulation looks like. I'm grateful that you had the courage to expose him. I'm grateful for everything we went through because it led me to the work I'm doing now and to the relationship I have with James. It showed me what real love looks like, the kind you showed me when you risked everything to protect me." As we stood there in the parking lot, I realized that Harper was right. The nightmare that had begun with a garbage can at a wedding reception had ultimately led to something beautiful. Not because the pain had been worth it, but because we had chosen to transform that pain into strength, wisdom, and service to others. Marcus Webb had tried to destroy my daughter's life, but instead, he had inadvertently given her a purpose that was more meaningful than anything she had been doing before. He had tried to turn her against me, but instead, he had shown her the difference between manipulation and genuine love. As I watched Harper drive away to meet James for dinner, I thought about the garbage can that had started it all. Marcus had meant it as the ultimate humiliation, a symbol of my worthlessness in Harper's life. But in the end, it had become something else entirely, a symbol of how quickly lies can be exposed when confronted with truth, and how love can survive even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy it. The old man who had been reduced to sitting on a garbage can at his daughter's wedding was gone. In his place was a father who had fought for his child and won, not through force or manipulation, but through patience, love, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. And that, I realized, was worth more than any revenge I could have imagined.